Today we're going to review some of the ways in which mobility is known to be affected by perceptual and cognitive factors. We'll start by looking at the functional roles played by the somatosensory system. Studies by Stein and Zier reveal that cutaneous inputs, stretch reflexes, and loading reflexes are enhanced during gait as compared to quiet stance, and that they are highly modulated across the different phases of the step cycle. This research reveals that reflexes are adapted to the distinct functional demands of each phase of the gait cycle. We will look more closely at the specifics of these adaptations over the next two slides. First, we'll look at the modulation of cutaneous reflexes involving the tibialis anterior. The tibialis anterior is largely inactive during stance phase, so we'll focus on the swing phase. During initial swing, the foot is in the air and the tibialis anterior is active. In this phase of gait, little cutaneous input is expected, unless that is, the foot strikes an object. If the foot does strike an object, rapid dorsiflexion is the functional response to get the foot up and out of the way of the obstacle. Accordingly, in this phase of the gait cycle, the cutaneous reflex is organized to be excitatory to the tibialis anterior in response to cutaneous input. Next, during the terminal swing phase, the foot is about to make contact with the ground and the tibialis anterior is active again. In this phase of gait, a lot of cutaneous input is expected. In contrast to the early swing phase, a rapid dorsiflexion of the tibialis anterior would be a dysfunctional response in this terminal stance phase. Accordingly, in this phase of the gait cycle, the cutaneous reflex is alternatively organized to be inhibitory to the tibialis anterior in response to cutaneous input. In sum, what we're seeing is that the functioning of the cutaneous reflex is reversed across initial and terminal swing phases. We were just looking at the modulation of cutaneous Now we're going to look at the phase-specific modulation of the phase-specific modulation of stretch reflexes in the ankle extensors. During the initial and mid-stance subphases, the center of mass is rotating up. The center of mass is rotating up. This movement over the foot dorsiflexes the ankle. This movement and dorsiflexes the ankle extensor and stretches the ankle extensors. In this moment, a large stretch reflex is going to be dysfunctional. The ankle extensor stretch reflex is going to create a plantar flexion torque that would act to slow or even reverse the forward momentum of the center of mass. Given this situation, the stretch reflex is organized to minimally excite ankle extensors during this part of stance phase. In the mid to terminal phase of stance, the center of mass is located in front of the foot. The ankle extensor stretch reflex here is functional. The plantar flexion torque created by this reflex can help in propelling the body forwards. Given this situation, we see that the stretch reflex is organized so that it strongly excites ankle extensors. We've just seen how reflexes are reorganized as a function of the particular phase of the gait cycle that they are activated in. Now let's look at how reflexes can be modulated as a function of the task that's being performed. Cutaneous reflexes in leg muscles are modulated as a function of the risk of instability during walking. Given this, let's look at an example of how a change in task constraints that changes walking stability can affect cutaneous reflexes. Harridis and colleagues investigated two tasks. The first task involved walking on a treadmill with arms crossed, and the second task involved walking on a treadmill while holding onto handrails that help stabilize the posture of the body. In the first task, Haridis and colleagues observed an increase in the amplitude of cutaneous reflex responses. In the second task, they observed a decrease in the amplitude of cutaneous reflex responses. As a side note to this research, both task and phase-dependent reflex modulation is mediated by descending cortical influences. Reflex mechanisms are also modulated as a function of the particular gait pattern that's being utilized for locomotion. Stein observed that stretch reflex gains are reduced during running. This is a functional adaptation, given that a high stretch gain reflex response will destabilize gait in the case of running. Stretch reflex gains have been shown to change quickly, within about 150 milliseconds, as a person transitions from a standing posture to a walking gait to a running gait. Somatosensory information is important for normal interlimb coordination. This particular role of somatosensory information is evident in the coordinated patterns of rhythmic arm movement and leg movements that are seen during human locomotion. This arm-leg coordination is modulated by interlimb reflexes. Haridis and Zem applied nerve stimulation to the hand or ankle. These stimulations resulted in phase-dependent modulation of interlimb reflexes that were acting on the muscles in all four of the limbs. These arm-leg coordination patterns are known to contribute to the maintenance of postural stability during gait, as well as to the efficiency of gait. The last, and perhaps the most profound example of the functional role of the somatosensory system in mobility comes from Ian Waterman. As we've discussed previously, Ian's idea of hell is trying to traverse a pebbled beach. Ian also has to carefully study each part of the environment around him before he's able to traverse it, and he needs to constantly visually monitor the movements that he's making. This stands in sharp contrast to adults with intact somatosensory systems, who are able to navigate complex environments using vision only 50% of the time, as we saw earlier. In this part of the class, we've already looked at multiple examples showing how vision plays an important role in proactive gait control. Now let's look more specifically at how optical information that's detected by the visual system can be used to control locomotion. When you move through the world, a pattern of optical motion is created. This pattern of motion is visualized here in this picture. Here the picture is taken as the camera is moving forwards through the world. The parts of the image that are blurring the most are those parts that have the greatest amount of optical motion. The blue arrows in the picture illustrate the direction and amount of optical motion that's occurring in each part of the image. What I hope you can get a sense from in this image is the rich pattern of optical structure that's created whenever you make a movement relative to the world around you. What happens during locomotion, then, is that when you move through the environment, that movement creates a pattern of optical motion. This optic flow pattern that's created contains information that specifies how you've moved relative to the world. To fully appreciate the significance of the optic flow field, it's useful to realize that the central nervous system devotes significant resources to detecting patterns of optical motion. As we've briefly discussed in the posture lectures, a global outflow pattern in the optic flow field specifies that you're moving forwards. And a global inflow pattern specifies that you're moving backwards. So what we're seeing here is that there's particular types of patterns of optical motion give you information about how you're moving. In both of these representations of the optic flow field that we see here, that we were discussing a couple of slides ago, there's a point in these representations where we can see no optical motion occurring. These points in these optic flow fields are points where the velocity of optic flow, where the velocity of optical motion is zero. This particular point in these flow fields specify the point towards which you're heading as you're moving. So as you move through the world, a pattern of optical motion is created. The location in the flow field where there is no motion is going to tell you about the direction that you're heading towards as you're moving. We just looked at how there can be information in the optic flow field specifying how we're moving through the environment. Let's now go and look at some examples of how patterns of optic flow can specify affordances, or possibilities for action. What we're talking about here is how optic flow patterns can provide information not only about how you're currently acting, but also information about how you could possibly act in the current situation. Here we see a wall with a doorway. If you're walking towards this wall and the door is open, then the rate of optical expansion will increase sharply at the boundary between the door and the wall. This optical pattern provides information about the depth of the room that's beyond the doorway, about the size and shape of the doorway, and about if the doorway is of a width and height that would allow your body to fit through it. Patterns of optical motion, like the one that we're looking at here, can carry information about both physical properties of the environment and affordance properties. Physical properties are action-independent properties, such as the physical size and shape of objects and surfaces in the environment around you. Affordance properties are action-relevant properties. In this example here, the affordance property might be, am I too tall to walk through this doorway without having to modify my action in a way to fit through it, like having to duck down or turn sideways to fit through it. Here we see another optic flow pattern. This is the optic flow pattern that's created when you're walking up to a ledge or a drop-off of some kind. The rate of optic flow expansion shifts abruptly across the edge of the drop-off. The optical patterns of motion that are created as you walk towards a ledge are going to provide information about how far in front of you the drop-off is, and it's also going to provide information about how big the drop-off is going to be. So in this figure we're seeing depicted the rates of optical motion in front of and beyond the ledge. The difference in the rate of optic flow in front of the ledge versus beyond the ledge carry information about how big the drop-off is. The optic flow information contains information about the physical property of how deep the drop-off is. For example, it might be a 50 centimeter deep drop-off. More importantly, though, information in these optic flow patterns contains information about whether the upcoming drop-off can be stepped down rather than climbed down. That is, it contains information about the action-relevant properties of the drop-off for you. The reason that action-relevant properties can be perceived is that optic flow information is scaled by the eye height of the perceiver. This means that the optic flow information will be different for a short person, for whom a 50 centimeter drop might need to be climbed down, as compared to a tall person who may be able to comfortably step down the upcoming drop-off. So, an affordance is a possibility for action offered by an object or surface to an individual with particular capabilities for action. This dandelion here affords climbing for a mouse and picking and blowing for a human. So we have the same object, same physical object in the world, but depending upon your capabilities for action, we see very different affordance properties. Affordances are the action-relevant or action-scaled possibilities of the environment. They represent a description of the environment in terms of the opportunities offered by that part of the environment for action. In the two pictures here, we see two kids walking up some steps. we can see that the kid on the left is forced to climb the steps, while the kid on the right is able to comfortably walk up the steps without needing to use their arms. Given the idea of affordances, the key question to ask is, can people perceive affordances? Is your perceptual system organized in a way such that you are able to look around the world and see the world in terms of its action possibilities? One of the clearest demonstrations of the ability to perceive affordances can be seen in studies of people's ability to perceive step heights that are energetically optimal. In other words, can you look at a step in front of you and perceive how comfortable or difficult it's going to be to step up on a given step? Before we look at people's ability to be able to perceive what parts of the world are easiest to step on, we need to gain an objective measure of what step heights are in fact energetically optimal to step on. To test this, researchers used a stepping machine that allowed for the height of the steps to be manipulated. While participants walked on this motorized stepping treadmill, a gas exchange system was used to measure the energy that was expended to walk up each step. Here we see the data for this experiment. The y-axis shows the energy per step, and the x-axis shows the height of the step being stepped on, divided by the leg length of the participant that was doing the stepping. Data points are shown for both shorter participants and taller participants. We can see the same pattern of results for both of these groups. Really short steps were more energetically costly, and really tall steps were more energetically costly. These steps that were about 25% of participants' leg length were the most energetically optimal to step on. You should notice that the minima at about 25% is the same for both the short and the tall participants. This tells us that there's a particular ratio of step height to leg length that defines optimal step-on ability for both short and tall people. What we're seeing here then is the affordance of step-on ability. So, returning to the question we started with, can people perceive the affordance of step-on ability? Participants were asked, when they were standing in front of a step, how comfortable it would be for them to step on the step. Given this task, let's look at the ratings that were given by participants for a range of step heights that were placed in front of them. On the y-axis, we have the step-on ability rating. Participants rated steps on a 1 through 7 scale. 7 meant the perfectly step-onable step was in front of you, and 1 meant that it would be uncomfortable to step on the step that was in front of you. As above, on the x-axis, we have step height divided by leg length. You will notice that the data points for both short and tall participants overlap again, and that they have a shared peak. This peak is at 25% again. What we see then is that participants are able to perceive the heights of the steps that are most comfortable for them to step on. In other words, they're able to perceive the affordance of step-on ability. The last example that looks at the role of vision in mobility that I want to cover looks at the challenge of catching a fly ball. The challenge of catching a fly ball involves watching the ball as it flies through the air and being able to perceive which way you should run in order to get to where the ball is going to land. We're going to look at how the optical patterns of motion that get created as a ball flies through the air can carry information that can tell you which way you should move in order to go and catch the ball. Here we see the basic challenge. A person in this diagram is standing where the blue arrow is pointing down. The black dots that we see in the image are showing the trajectory of the ball as it's flying through the air towards the person standing on the ground. In the situation depicted here, we see that the ball is going to land behind where the blue arrow is pointing. So it's going to land behind the person unless they start running backwards to get to where the ball is actually going to be landing. The white dots in this image, show the projected image of the ball. This represents where the ball is seen to be from the perspective of the fielder. The dashed lines show the relationship between the position of the ball as it's flying through the air and the projected image of the ball. Here we see how the ball is moving as is seen from the perspective of the fielder. The circles here show how the ball is appearing in the visual field of the observer. The important thing to pay attention to here is the optical pattern of motion that's created. Note that the optical position of the ball is accelerating. That is, as the ball flies towards the fielder, the image of the ball is seen to move upwards faster and faster. What we're seeing then is that there's an acceleration of the image of the ball on the retina. Now let's look at a slightly different situation. Here we see the situation where the ball is going to land exactly where the fielder is standing. Here we again see how the ball is visually appearing in the visual field of the observer. We can see that a very different pattern of optical motion is created. In this case, there's no optical acceleration. Instead, the image of the ball, as it's seen from by the fielder, is seen to move up in the visual field with a constant velocity of optical motion. Here we see the final scenario, where the ball is going to land in front of the fielder unless the fielder runs forward to intercept it. When we look at how the ball appears in the visual field of the observer, we see an optical deceleration. What you should be beginning to appreciate by now is that if you detect the particular optical pattern of motion, you can get information about how you should move. If you detect an optical acceleration of the ball, you should run backwards. If there's no optical acceleration, you should stay where you are, and if you detect an optical deceleration in the image of the ball, you should start running backwards. The lesson here is that a simple optical variable can provide information about how you should act in this particular situation in order to intercept the ball. In the last part of this lecture, we'll be looking at how cognitive factors play a role in mobility. Ebersbach and colleagues investigated how performing another task at the same time as walking impacts the control of walking. In this particular study, the researchers asked participants to walk while performing one of three tasks. The first task was a memory retention task. In this task, participants tried to remember a sequence of numbers that was presented sequentially on a display screen. The next task was a fine motor task. In this task, participants had to open and close a coat button while they were walking. The last task was a coordination task. In this task, participants quickly tapped their fingers while they were walking. The take-home message of this research study was that concurrent tasks had a small but significant effect on walking. The fine motor and memory tasks produced small increases in double support time, suggesting that gait was slightly reorganized so as to be more stable. The coordination task produced a small increase in frequency. The researchers also observed that walking impacted performance on the memory retention task. Here we see that performing the memory retention task while standing quietly led to a larger number of digits being recalled compared to when the task was performed while walking. The broad strokes takeaway of the study by Ebersbach and colleagues is that simple cognitive tasks don't present a significant threat to stability of mobility for young healthy adults. But what about more complex and attention-grabbing cognitive tasks like cell phone use? Here we see some data from Nassar and Troyer, showing injuries in the United States that were related to the use of cell phones. The y-axis shows the number of injuries per year, and the x-axis shows each year. We can see that during a period of time where there was a significant increase in cell phone usage, that there was an associated increase in both injuries to drivers associated with cell phone usage while driving, and injuries to pedestrians associated with cell phone usage while they were walking. More specific insights into the natures of mobility impairments that result from cell phone usage can be drawn from the work of Hyman and colleagues. In this study, young adults that were using their cell phones were observed as they walked around their college campus. Cell phone usage was associated with weaving more, walking more slowly, and making more abrupt direction changes. In this study, they also observed that cell phone usage was associated with an increase in the number of near collisions with other pedestrians, as well as an inability to notice unusual events in the surrounding environment. An inability to notice unusual events was investigated in this study by having a clown unicycle through the part of campus being studied. It seems to me, at least, that you are definitely functionally impaired if you can't notice a scary-ass clown on a unicycle moving through the environment. The more serious implications of cell phone usage have been directly experimentally studied in virtual reality environments. Participants travelling around this virtual reality environment were significantly more likely to be hit by a vehicle if they were listening to music or they were texting. Chen and colleagues investigated how performing cognitive tasks while walking could affect the likelihood of tripping over an obstacle. They had participants walk on a treadmill while performing the simple cognitive reaction task of saying "ah" as quickly as possible after seeing a red light in front of them flash on. In this experiment, a projector on the ceiling was used to project virtual obstacles onto the treadmill belt. The obstacles were organised to appear about 350 milliseconds before hill strike. This situation simulates the situation of being able to notice a hazard to locomotion. Performance was assessed using an obstacle avoidance score. A score of 1 was given if the participant completely avoided stepping on the projected line. A score of 0.5 was given if the obstacle was avoided, but gait-perturbing adjustments were needed. Examples of observed adjustments included rotating the forefoot laterally at the last instant, and dorsiflexing the ankle so that only the heel contacted the walkway surface. Here we see the results of this research. We can see that young, healthy adults have better obstacle avoidance scores compared to older adults, and we can also see that obstacle avoidance scores are lower when a cognitive task has to be performed. In sum, the abilities of both young and older subjects to be able to move through the environment without tripping over an obstacle is impaired when their attention is divided and they're paying attention to a particular stimuli in the environment. The last study I want to look at today considered how the ability to perform a cognitive task is impacted by different levels of mobility challenge. In this research, participants were tasked with quickly verbally responding to words they heard over a loudspeaker. This task was performed while the participant was either seated, walking on level ground, stepping over a smaller obstacle that was 2.5% of the participant's body height, or stepping over a larger obstacle that was 10% of the participant's body height. Here we see the results of this research. On the y-axis, we can see the performance of the cognitive task, the ability to respond verbally to the auditory stimuli, and on the x-axis we can see the different levels of mobility challenge, going from seated to walking on level ground to stepping over the obstacles of different height. What we see here is that the ability to quickly react to the auditory stimuli was impaired if the task was performed while stepping over an obstacle. These results suggest that the task of stepping over an obstacle uses up cognitive resources and can therefore impact cognitive performance. A very interesting additional finding from this research was that attention can be flexibly directed to either the motor task, the cognitive task, or it can be split between these tasks. The researchers had participants perform the task of stepping over the obstacle while verbally responding to the auditory stimuli in 3 different ways. They had participants either specifically focus on the obstacle crossing task, specifically focus on the cognitive reaction task, or not prioritize either task. Here we see the results for the cognitive task performance in this experiment. We see that if participants are instructed to prioritize quickly reacting to the auditory stimuli, that they're able to do this. Here we see the results for trailing leg toe clearance. We see that if participants are instructed to prioritize safely stepping over the obstacle, that toe performance is improved. So what we're seeing here is that people are able to flexibly reorganize their cognitive resources in a way that allows them to adapt themselves to the meaningful dimensions of the particular task and environment that they are interacting with. That wraps up our coverage of the basics of mobility.